In this lecture, we will survey the historical and literary contexts of Basho's narrow road to the deep north. Matsuo Basho was a Zen Buddhist monk and a Japanese poet of the 17th century best known for his haikus. His grandfather and great-grandfather belonged to the samurai class, but by Basho's generation the family had fallen and become farmers. Basho is writing during the Tokugawa shogunate, or the period ruled by the Tokugawa shoguns. Shoguns are kind of like governors or generals assigned by the emperor and meant to stand in for the emperor, but at this time the emperor had no real power, and all the power was concentrated in the shoguns of the Tokugawa clan. The Tokugawa shogunate is also called the Edo period, Edo being the old name for Tokyo, from where the Tokugawa shogunate ruled, and today Tokyo remains the capital of Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate is marked by peace and order, following a series of civil wars and feuding military clans that resulted in much bloodshed and unrest in Japan. The Tokugawa clan that came to power in the 17th century reinforced unity and stability in Japan, and as a result we see the samurai, originally a warrior class, turn into bureaucrats, as well as other modernizations such as the rise of the merchant class and use of money in transactions in the place of rice. During the Edo period, Christianity came and went, resulting in the Tokugawa shoguns feeling threatened by the political influence of the Christians and thus establishing the infamous isolationist policy from which Japan would only emerge in the late 19th century. However, at the same time, the Christians had brought mass printing, and with mass printing came, as usual, broader access to education and increased literacy for even the lower social classes, including the artisans, merchants, and farmers. And due to the increased literacy of the lower classes, there emerged a vernacular revolution. So the Edo period becomes a time of two distinct branches of literature. On one hand, there are the forms of literature that come from authoritative genres and traditions of classical Chinese and classical Japanese literature. They focused on subjects stressed by the aristocracy, such as nature and love, and in general may be associated with refinement and elegance, that which is noble. This type of literature is called ga. Then we have the other forms of literature that focused on low subject matter, prostitutes, potatoes, and piss, as we might say, things associated with the common, erotic, and popular, usually written in the vernacular, commonly irreverent towards authority figures and classical traditions, and overall associated with the violence, comedy, and general high-spiritedness of urban culture. This type of literature is called zoku. To be clear then, these terms are used to describe genres, not the quality of the works. That is, even if a form of ga is written poorly, it is still considered ga. The distinction between zoku and ga is also indicative of the individual versus authority trope that we've been seeing in each of our Enlightenment texts. The haiku for which Basho is known for comes from the haikai. Haikai is a form of collaborative verse, or verse that one writes in collaboration with others. It alternates between three-line stanzas and two-line stanzas, with each poet alternatingly contributing a stanza and the first lines of each stanza linking to the last lines of the previous stanzas. In the Edo period, given the rise of the common classes, the subject matter typically concerned something vulgar and comical. Haikai is of the zoku tradition. Basho changed all this. He was highly influenced by Chinese culture and wanted to elevate the form of the haikai in order to communicate classical topics of poetry through contemporary language and art, so he gave the popular vernacular form of the haikai spiritual and refined content, focusing on rural simplicity and purity rather than the stylish activities of the city, and in so doing he succeeded in raising the haikai from the status of light entertainment to a serious literary genre that would become one of the only forms of Japanese literature to become world-renowned, the haiku. The haiku is the first stanza of the haikai. You all have probably encountered the haiku at one point or another, but let's review the common features to make sure everyone's on the same page. The haiku consists of three lines with 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and 5 syllables in the third line. You may feel as though you're having trouble seeing the 575 structure in Basho's haikus, but this is because they're translated. So keep in mind the original Japanese versions come in this structure, and you can see the 575 structure in haikus that were originally written in English. As mentioned earlier, Basho is a Chan, or Zen Buddhist, and for him the haiku becomes a vessel for Buddhist philosophy. For instance, one of the key features of the haiku is that it captures a haiku moment, or the moment in which we observe and instantaneously react to an experience. If you're familiar with imagist poetry, you can pull on your knowledge of imagism to inform your understanding of haikus. Imagism was inspired by the haiku tradition. So haikus aren't supposed to be endlessly descriptive like novels, and they're not really supposed to be retrospectively reflective either, but instead are supposed to be snapshots that convey that initial raw emotional or intellectual experience. In this way, the haiku often represents the transience and impermanence of things, things as they are happening or things as they're decaying, things as they are simply in that particular moment. All this stresses the acceptance of impermanence, which is important in Zen Buddhism, and this too is captured in a particular Japanese aesthetic known as wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi may be described as an aesthetic that appreciates subtle tastes, elegant simplicity, and subdued refinement. It finds beauty in the imperfect, the impermanent, and the incomplete. A good example of this is the art of kintsugi, or the art of repairing broken pottery with golden lacquer. There's a neat story behind how this kind of art started. There was once a Japanese shogun who had a beautiful tea bowl. It was one of his prized possessions, but one day it was knocked over and broken. So the shogun sent it off to be repaired. It came back with these horrible, ugly staples holding it together. Dissatisfied, the shogun sent it off again, demanding that the bowl be fixed, but made beautiful. Thinking on how to do this, craftsmen came up with the idea to not hide the cracks, but to accentuate them by using golden lacquer to glue the pieces back together, so every crack was lined with gold, and this made the shogun happy. The core idea of wabi-sabi is to become aware of and have gratitude for all things that pass, to know that nothing is permanent, and it is because of this impermanence that life has the power to move us. This is why Japanese culture gives such great attention each year to the blossoming of the cherry trees. Cherry blossoms only really last a week, and so people gather to see them as they blossom in a kind of wave washing over the country. At the same time that the haiku should capture a moment, it should strive to capture the whole experience in that one moment. And to do this, the haiku employs two particular devices, the kigo and poetic places. Not every haiku refers to a poetic place, but all haikus use a kigo. A kigo is the season word used to indicate the particular season or month being described in the haiku. So for instance, words like cherry blossoms and flowers would indicate that it's spring, cicadas, fireflies, frogs, storms, and planters' songs would indicate summer, the moon, falling leaves, cold weather, long nights would indicate autumn, and snow, a mochi, which is a food, drying socks would indicate winter. Season words conjure up a dense association of feelings that help to broaden the scope and complexity of the poem. And so when a poem suggests that it's spring, you're not just supposed to know that it's spring, but you're supposed to feel that it's spring. Recall your own memories of spring, the smells, sights, and sounds. Poetic places likewise conjure up a dense association of memories and feelings. Poetic places are references to historical sites or sites that have well-known religious, national, or cultural value. By referencing poetic places, a poet adds to the depth of the poem without having to directly or explicitly spell out every feeling and association with the place. These two devices, the kigo and the use of poetic places, exercise another principle of Zen Buddhism to which Basho adhered. Basho believed that poets should rid their minds of all superficiality. This in part is why he writes of nature, to get away from the materialistic world of the cities. Renouncing material possessions is also part of the Buddhist monk life. The kigo and poetic places function similarly. They don't bog down a poem with needless descriptions, but instead allow a kind of lightness that frees the poet and reader from a material world. Finally, haikus are typically split in half by a kireji, a dash or some other punctuation mark like ellipses or semicolons that divide the poem into two parts, whereas each part can stand independent of each other while also enriching our understanding of each other when read as a whole. It's important to know that the two halves can represent opposing images or they can represent parallel images to reinforce certain ideas. In Basho's Narrow Road to the Deep North, you can also see how the prose text around the haikus adds context to your reading of each haiku. Narrow Road is supposed to be Basho's personal account or diary of his 5-month journey to and from the north of Japan in the year of 1689. The north wasn't usually a destination point for travelers, since the weather and landscape could be cold and harsh. However, Basho embarks on this journey with his friend Sora to visit the poetic places, and along the way we'll find that he has embarked upon a Buddhist journey of enlightenment as well. So let's take one example of a haiku and work our way through it to get a sense of how we should be reading this text, because there's honestly a lot of unpacking that must be done with haikus. On page 325, we have our first haiku from Basho's Narrow Road. So let's start with that one. The haiku reads, "Time even for the grass hut to change owners, House of Dolls." In this poem, we should be able to identify the kigo, the kireji, how the two halves divided by the kireji enrich the meaning of the poem as a whole, and its connection to the prose context. Go ahead and pause the video to try to identify these features on your own, and then hit play when you're ready to continue. So let's start with the kigo, or season word. The kigo is House of Dolls. As your footnote tells you, the House of Dolls phrase indicates to us that it is the time of the Doll Festival, or as I think it's more commonly known, Girls' Day Festival, which occurs around March 3rd or in the spring. The kireji is the dash that appears in the second line. The first half of the poem then presents an image of a grass hut, where Basho, as a bachelor, lived on his own. The second half of the poem presents the image of the House of Dolls, which suggests domesticity and femininity. These two halves present opposite images from the male to female, bachelorhood to family, and thus on one hand indicate the transience of a scene, as ownership must shift from one to the other. It also represents the transience of Basho's own state. He is embarking on a Buddhist journey of enlightenment, and as such, he has to renounce any claims he might have to family. Thus, when he leaves this scene of domesticity behind, in order to free himself of the emotional ties that might prevent his enlightenment. The sense of transience and a Buddhist quest is also underscored by portions of the prose preceding the haiku, where Basho explains that a kind of wanderlust spirit or deity of the road possessed him and made him restless, urging him to leave on his 5-month journey so that he may see the, quote, famous moon at Matsushima, moons also being representative of purity and enlightenment, as well as the end of a journey being representative of the autumn season. So there's a lot to unpack in each of Basho's haikus. As you go through the haikus, it may be helpful to consider how each describes a literal moment during Basho's journey to and from the north, as well as how each suggests a further step in the spiritual journey towards Buddhist enlightenment. Further information about Buddhism is in our lecture on Chang'an and the Journey to the West. There are a lot of cultural references that make Basho's reading difficult, so feel free to look up any phrases or locations that you suspect may have cultural significance. Be sure to pay attention to the footnotes, and be sure to analyze the prose surrounding each haiku, as these help to provide context as well.